Hello, my name is Professor Julie Brown. I'm an instructor of English and Humanities at Clatsop Community College in Astoria, Oregon. This presentation is about the Bible, and it explains how it was transformed from a written document that was in Latin to a printed book that was in English. My life is an incunabulist. I calling my presentation this because I was, for one summer, an incunabulist, which is a person who studies books printed on a printing press between 1485 and 1500. And I studied these books in the summer of 2014 when I was a student at Oxford University. Oxford is a very beautiful college, one of the oldest in the world. It was established around the year 1200 and evolved over time. Oxford University refers to a collection of about 20 different college campuses. The college I was at was known as St. Edward's School or Tuddy Hall, and this is the dormitory that I lived in. It was built in the 1400s, and my room was in that very top gable, the very top windows. Here's my desk with a view out looking over the courtyard of Tuddy Hall. Here's one of the classrooms I studied in. There were students from all over the world. This woman sitting next to me, I'm the blonde one on the left, and next to me is Su Fong, who's from Malaysia. Sometimes it was kind of hard to study because you look up at the beautiful ceilings in the classrooms. You can see how decorated and gorgeous they are. Another beautiful ceiling. This is me giving a presentation about the poet Anne Bradstreet. She was the first poet in America to have a book published on a printing press. I was able to do a little bit of research about her. She was born in England, but wrote poetry in America. While I was there, I tried to study up on some of the writers who came from Oxford. One, of course, is Lewis Carroll, a math professor who wrote a famous book called Alice in Wonderland about a little girl he knew named Alice. And on the left is the candy shop where she would go, and it was called Alice's Shop. And on the right is me renting a little boat and traveling down the river Thames, or Isis, which is the same place where Lewis Carroll would take Alice and some friends out for a pleasant day of boating on the river. Two other famous writers to come from Oxford are C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And at this pub down the road, the Eagle and Child, the two of them would meet for a pint of beer and talk about writing. This is the Bodleian Library, which is, first of all, a gorgeous Renaissance library, and then the books within it are quite ornate and quite beautiful. You have to get special permission. It's hard to get a library card, but I do have one. Some of the older books have to be handled with gloves so that the oil from your hands doesn't damage them. The librarian explained to me that some of the books during the Renaissance and medieval times were chained to the shelves because the students were poor sometimes and would try to steal a book. Another place I got to study was at the British Library, which is in London, and it houses a remarkable collection of books. It's kind of like our Library of Congress, including the first copy of Shakespeare, the first copy of Charles Dickens, the first copy of Jane Austen's books and Emily Bronte's books, and the first copy of Harry Potter. Here's one of the oldest beautiful books that I got to study, a handwritten document with beautiful illuminated capital letters. So the first step in getting the Bible into our modern format is that it was in Latin but had to be translated into English. It was in Latin because that was the language that the priests, bishops, archbishops, and popes could speak, but the average Englishman, the average English sheep farmer or merchant, could not read or speak. And so John Wycliffe, who was a professor at Oxford, thought it would be really nice if the people could read their Bible in their own native language. And so he translated the Bible into English in 1385, which was really a remarkable thing for the people of England, but it made the church very angry, and he was labeled as a heretic. Here is a copy of his handwritten Bible in English for the first time. The Catholic Church was so furious with him, they confiscated as many of his books as they could find. There weren't that many because they were handwritten and hand copied. They gathered them up and burned them. And then they condemned him to death. But before they could catch him, he died of a stroke and was buried. Well, being angry about this, the Catholic Church sent some people out to dig up his body and to burn it, and then to scatter his ashes in the river so he couldn't go to heaven, I guess. Anyone who was his friend or his follower was captured and burned at the stake. Anyone who dared to pray in English or talk to God in English or teach their children to pray in English or memorized a Bible verse in English was punished. The next step would have been to get this handwritten document printed on a printing press, because that's the way that you can make many copies quickly and send them out to folks. William Caxton was the first publisher who printed books in the English language. He was actually a wool trader, and the way he started in life was to buy wool from sheep farmers in England and then travel by boat to Belgium, where the world's best weavers lived. And as he was traveling back and forth, buying wool in England and selling it in Belgium, he met some people who had printing presses, and they were in Antwerp, Belgium. And he saw the printing press, thought it was very interesting, learned how to use it, and actually bought one for himself. This museum in Antwerp houses some very, very old printing presses, and this is in the building where Caxton learned how to print on a printing press. I got to study there for 1 week, and this is on the left. You see the oldest printing press that is in existence in Europe, and on the right you can see the printer's tray with all of the different letters of the alphabet that you would have to choose the letters of the words that you wanted to print and then fit them on the press on the left, rub ink on them, put a clean piece of paper on the top, and then press it shut to have it print. Here is the first book printed in the English language, printed by Caxton. And it's not the Bible, but it's a story about the Trojan War. And he chose this one because Princess Margaret said it was her favorite story, and he was a very wise businessman to keep the monarchy happy. Well, now we have the Bible translated into English by Wycliffe, and we know how to print things thanks to Caxton. So the next step then would be to print the Bible in English on a printing press. And that task was taken on by William Tyndale, also an Oxford scholar, who was the first translator and printer of the New Testament into English in 1530. And this is the library in Antwerp, where he met people who had access to printing presses and talked to them in secret about the wonderful project of printing books in English. And he did this in Antwerp, in Belgium. When the church found out, they became angry. They gathered all of the books. They burned them. They condemned him to death, just like they had with Wycliffe. And while he was attending church in this beautiful church in Antwerp, which I had the opportunity to visit, he was captured while he was in the church, and he escaped. They chased him all around town. Eventually, they caught him, and his punishment was first to be strangled. And if that wasn't enough, they would then take his dead, strangled body, possibly not even dead yet, and burn it at the stake. And it was said that there was a miracle, that out of his mouth came the words, "Oh, God, please open up the eyes of the King of England." hoping that the king would get the idea to take this further, which is what happened a few years later. King Henry VIII commissions the Great Bible, the first Bible to be printed in English, sanctioned by the king himself, and so whoever was involved in this couldn't be punished. Here's a copy of the Great Bible, and it's not the best copy of the Bible in English because it was kind of a hodgepodge of a little Tyndale, a little Wycliffe, just kind of bits and pieces of whatever they could find and put together. But it was a done deal, and it also took on the format that we see here, which is to have the books of the Bible broken into chapters, and then each chapter broken into verses. And as you can see, it's in several columns, which is a more efficient and easier way to read it. King James, who was followed after Queen Elizabeth and King Henry, in 1604 commissioned the King James Bible, which is one that many of us are familiar with. I grew up with a King James Bible in my house, and he hired and commissioned the very best scholars of the day, professors at Oxford. They met, and it took many years to go through the Bible from the beginning and translate it into something that is accurate and poetic and beautiful. Here's a copy of the King James Bible, and as you can see, there were engravings included into it, which were hand colored by artists so that you could have your own colored illustrations of the Bible. Some versions of it were printed very tiny so that you could conveniently put your little Bible in your purse or in your pocket. This King James Bible is called the Scholar's Edition. If you fancied yourself to be a scholar, you could read it in English, but also in Latin, in Greek, in Hebrew, and I think the fifth language is in German. It was in 5 different languages. I became sort of curious about some of the marginalia or little comments that people wrote in their Bibles. They weren't trying to be disrespectful to the book. They were trying to engage with it in a very personal way and to take notes, maybe of what their pastor said in church or an idea that occurred to them. And it showed that they were actively engaged in reading the Bible. I noticed after a while how many of them used a tiny hand, like this one here in the middle of the page, pointing to a Bible verse that was important to them. And there's a word for that little hand, and it's called a manicule. Man meaning your hand, like a manicure, but cule meaning something small, like a molecule is small. So a manicule is a small hand, and it's always a finger, always pointing at something that the artist wants you to notice. This one with a sort of obnoxious droopy finger and a little cuff on a little lace on the cuff there. This one with a very long finger pointing to someone's favorite verse. This one with fancy fingernails and a cuff. Even fancier cuff. Love this one. The hand is so heavy the guy has to put it on a little wheelbarrow to point to his favorite verse. This one looks like it could be on a ZZ Top record cover. After I was done studying in Oxford, I went back to Heathrow Airport in London to come home, and I found a manicule on a cocktail bar sign. Halfway home, I stopped in Alaska to do a little bit of fishing, and I noticed this manicule in Alaska at an artist fair. I got back to Portland Airport, and I saw this manicule in a window sign advertising someone was hiring. Driving home from the airport, I stopped in Rainier and saw a manicule on the mini mart. And then when I got home, my neighbor 5 doors down is selling dahlias in her front yard, and she has a manicule on her dahlia. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation about the translation and printing of the Bible with some bonus information about manicules. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.